Friends, our Old Testament lesson today comes from the book of Genesis, the 12th chapter, beginning with the first verse. Listen for the word of God. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Melt us, mold us, fill us, and use us. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. And to that end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. This is how we are introduced to the patriarch of three faith traditions here in the 12th chapter of Genesis. So Abram went. Now, if you're anything like me, you may have found yourself flipping back a few chapters, looking for a little bit more of a full introduction to this patriarch of the faith, or at least some clue as to why it was Abram, soon to be Abraham, whom God chose. But flipping back to the 10th and 11th chapters of Genesis, we get very little. There's a long genealogy from Noah to Abram's father, with a quick detour through the Tower of Babel. We learn that Abram has two brothers, one of whom dies, leaving a surviving son named Lot. We learn that Abram takes a wife, Sarai, who is barren, and we learn that Abram's father dies. And that's it. That is the great introduction to Abram that we get in the book of Genesis. No idea why God chose him. No extensive list of his qualifications, no resume, no exceptional pedigree, no list of credentials giving us any idea why God would choose Abram. And yet in the very first verse of the 12th chapter of Genesis, God chooses Abram anyway. Go from your country, go from your kin, go from your father's house and everything you have ever known in this world, and go, for I will show you where. I will make of you a great nation, I will make your name great, and I will bless you so that you will be a blessing. Go. So Abram went. Now there are many questions that come to mind when I read this text. Why in the world did Abram leave everything he'd ever known? Why was this call so magical and so deep? And unfortunately, there is no answer to those questions in the text, and we're not going to get to all of them today. But I also find myself asking, why Abram? Again, why was he so special? Why him and not someone else? And the text itself gives us little assistance in answering this question. But fortunately for us, we know the God who called Abram. You see, the God who called Abram is the same God we know and love and worship today. It's the same God that we have known to be alive and at work in our hearts, in our families, in this church, and in our world. And even millenniums later, God still seems to be up to some of the same old tricks. God is still in the business of calling those who are unqualified, ill-equipped, and exceptionally ordinary. much like our friend Abram. And God is still in the business of blessing those unqualified, ill-equipped, and exceptionally ordinary people so that they might be a blessing to others. I'm going to invite you to look around the sanctuary for a minute. Look at the people in front of you, those behind you. Turn all the way around by chance. There are people back there too. Look at the people sitting around you in this place. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that most, if not all of you, can look around at the people who are gathered here today and recall a time when you have been blessed by someone sitting in this sanctuary. I know I can, and I've only been here a year and a half. Perhaps what springs to mind is a kind word, or a knowing glance, or much-needed embrace, or a phone call, or a gift, or a visit when you were at your worst, or when you were terrified, or when you didn't think you'd ever emerge from the darkness. Chances are you've known the gift of God's blessing from someone in this place. And I'm going to go out on another limb and guess that the person or the people who blessed you on any one of those days or in any one of those moments wasn't thinking to themselves as they called or visited or hugged you, I guess it's good I'm here because I'm certainly the most qualified for this moment. Rather, I imagine the person who blessed you was far more inclined to think of him or herself as wholly unqualified. I don't know what to say. I don't know how I can help. I don't know that my presence will make any difference at all. I have no idea what I can do. And yet you know their presence made a difference. Dare I say, even blessed you on a day or in a moment when you needed it most? If you can't think of a time when you've been blessed by someone in this place, I imagine I can think of one for you. Because do you have any idea the number of stories that I have heard in my 18 months here of how, by God's grace, you have been a blessing to one another again and again? Over cups of coffee and shared meals and joyful, tearful conversations, you have shared with me how this church saved your life. You have shared with me how this church saw you through the darkest season of your life. How this church is more of a home than your own house. How this church loved your children so well and joyfully made room for the wreckage of your life too. You shared with me how you felt cared for in this place when the rest of the world seemed not to care at all. How it is here among God's family at Morrisville Presbyterian Church where you have felt known and loved and cared for again and again and again. That is the story of God's blessing that I have heard so many times from all of you. And maybe you didn't feel qualified to sit alongside your friend as his spouse was dying. Maybe you didn't think you had anything to offer to high school seminar when someone asked you to teach. Maybe you thought this church was crazy for asking you to serve as an elder, a deacon, or a trustee. Maybe you thought you were the last person on earth who would have anything to offer to the household of God. And yet, as we learn from Father Abram, God doesn't always call the equipped, but God will always equip those whom God calls. God has a habit a habit of using those who are very, very ordinary and unqualified to do the extraordinary. Now, I realize that sitting with a friend, or making someone a meal, or serving on a church committee, or teaching Sunday school may not feel like the most extraordinary calling. But you know what is extraordinary? It's extraordinary that even amidst your own self-doubt, even amidst your hesitation and your insecurity, even amidst your exhaustion and your exceptional ordinariness, God will continue to use you and mold you and shape you and call you. God is not finished with you, and God has and will continue to bless you so that by God's grace you might be a blessing to others. That is an extraordinary promise that God makes to me and you. And by God's grace here together at Morrisville Presbyterian Church, you and I bear witness to God's extraordinary promises every day. Promises that God makes to be with us, to bless us, and never to leave us to journey alone. For it is here at MPC that the extraordinary depth of God's love is offered to friends and strangers alike. It is here in this place that God has gifted so many of you with extraordinary gifts to care for one another, to serve one another, and to serve the community in which we reside. It is here where so many of you have been given gifts that reflect God's extraordinary hospitality. Hospitality that is abundant and freely given and always makes room for more. And it is here that I have had the privilege to know your extraordinary heart, open to be molded and shaped and led by God for whatever God has planned for our future together. Friends, the list of our ordinariness could go on for miles. And yet God has done, is doing, and will continue to do extraordinary things among us. Because thanks be to God, God has done it before, and thanks be to God, God is not finished with this church yet. In the past few days, you should have received an estimate of giving card in your mailbox. If you haven't, there will be cards available from the deacons as you leave today. What's an estimate of giving card? Well, I will tell you again if you were here last week. It is an opportunity to provide an estimate of what you're willing to commit financially to the mission and ministries of Morrisville Presbyterian Church in the coming year. And I will stress again, your response is extremely important. The estimate that you provide helps us to plan responsibly in the coming year, and it helps us to continue to provide life-giving ministries in this congregation and in the life of our wider world so that we might be a blessing to one another and a blessing to the world in the ways that God calls us to be. And I think it's pretty rare in our world today to feel the extraordinary love and blessing of God so deeply within a community of people, especially a community like the one we know here at Morrisville Presbyterian Church. People gathered for worship and nurture and scattered to serve and to love. It is my hope and prayer that in gratitude for the wealth of blessings that you have known in and through this place, you might join me in financially investing in the future that God is calling us toward here at MPC. Because thanks be to God, God is not finished with us yet. And how blessed we are to have the capacity to be such a blessing to each other and to God's world. Today, as we have done many times before, and by God's grace we will do many times again, we're going to gather around this font of new birth. And as we gather, we are reminded of our own baptism, and thus reminded of God's love poured out to each of us, whether or not we are deserving, whether or not we ever felt qualified for the journey ahead. We are reminded of the sacred blessing God has offered to us so that we might go into the world and by God's grace be a blessing to so many others. It is our call. It is the call we know in this font, and it is also the extraordinary promise of God. Thankfully, many years ago, an unqualified, ill-equipped nobody was somebody to God, as tends to be the case. Thankfully, that somebody said yes to God all those years ago and followed wherever it was that God would lead. And thankfully, God is still in the business of using the unqualified and ill-equipped to love and bless the world. If we know we have been a blessing to one another inside the walls of this church, just imagine what kind of blessing we have been and can continue to be to the world outside the church walls as well. By God's grace, friends, we have been blessed. And by God's grace, we can continue to be a blessing. Thanks be to God. Amen.